Hello, everyone. I hope you got a nice break. As some of you may know, I'm Evan Anderson. I run our InventIP initiative, which is focused on fighting nation-sponsored intellectual property theft, and for that reason, we often focus on China. It's my great honor today to be joined by Dmitri Alperovitch. He will be in virtually with us. So thank you, Dmitri. I know you're very busy. I really appreciate your time. Dmitri is the co-founder, if anyone doesn't know, of CrowdStrike, which is a massively successful cybersecurity firm. That's actually where I, of course, encountered your work first, Dmitri, particularly all the great work you did on APT groups. But you've also now founded the Silverado Policy Accelerator, and you're doing lots of very interesting work there. And I think maybe it would help the crowd if we just move right into kind of tell us how that happened, right? What led you to do that, and why did you think a policy accelerator was the most important thing, and what are you trying to achieve?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. My Chief of Staff, Mark Raimondi, is in the audience. If anyone wants to know more about what we do, he's going to be happy to help answer those questions. But basically, first of all, I'm an immigrant to this country. This country has been incredibly good to me. I came when I was about 14 years old and was able to be very successful in technology. And one of the things I've always been very passionate about is giving back in a variety of ways, including to this country. And Silverado really came out of that desire. Once I retired from CrowdStrike in 2020, I wanted to see what I could do to help move the nation forward and focus on accelerating policy in the area where I think we have the greatest challenge facing this country in the 21st century, which is the renewed great power competition, primarily vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China, I should say, although Russia certainly poses a threat as well. So that's been really the big focus of Silverado, is focusing on national security, military strategy, trade and energy security, as well as the issues of semiconductors and critical materials. We've been working on that for about 3 years in trying to move the executive branch, legislative branch forward incrementally. We very much believe in incremental progress. It's better to move one step forward every day versus run a mile in 10 years, is our view on things. And particularly with this challenge that we face with China, we can't afford to wait too long. We have to make progress every single day.
Yeah, I think that rings more true every single day as well, right? And that kind of reminds me, so when Mark Raimondi was up earlier, he did mention your piece, which I read, which was quite good, that you recently put out about chips. And of course, we're here to talk about Taiwan, and there's no more important conversation when it comes to Taiwan than the massive chip industry in Taiwan, but also the massive importance of that industry to the global economy now. Can you kind of explain what you published to the folks who may not have read it? By the way, I'll put a link into our group chat later so that everyone can see it. We'll make sure to get it to you. But can you explain what you were doing there?
Yeah, so the semiconductor industry is a very obviously technical industry. There's a lot of complexities to it, and a lot of people are trying to simplify it. And unfortunately, this is the one topic that is very, very difficult to simplify. And as someone who's been focused on technology for 20 years, actually briefly worked at Intel as well, the details here matter. In fact, in most areas, that's true as well, but particularly in this area. And one challenge that we've seen in terms of the articulation to policymakers on this issue over the last couple of years, particularly with the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act, has been this focus on advanced chips, right? Leading edge chips that are at 3 nanometers or soon to be 2 nanometers. And everyone in DC is sort of focused off, well, how do we make sure that we, and not Taiwan and certainly not China, own that space? And that's really important. But the reality is that there's just really a few use cases for advanced chips. First and foremost, it's your phone, it's your laptop that is going to be using those advanced chips. It's your Xbox and PlayStation platforms, so gaming is a very, very large market. But I would argue, if we had to live without advanced chips for a few years in those areas, we would probably survive as a nation. Not sure our kids would, but hopefully they would, right? And then you have a couple of other areas where advanced chips are really critical. The big one really is cloud computing, and particularly the GPUs that are now used for training AI. And then a very small cross-section of weapon systems, precision-guided munitions, where you use advanced chips for guidance. But literally everything else around us, the entire world, every single electronics we see is not using advanced chips. It's using what we call foundational chips. Some in the industry have traditionally called it legacy or mature chips. We're trying to change the language around it because we believe that those words don't actually accurately represent the advances in technologies on those chips. Just because something is 40 nanometers or 60 nanometers does not mean it's not advanced and does not mean that it's not evolving continuously. And legacy and mature kind of make it seem like, oh, we're about to throw this out and replace it with 2 nanometer chips. And that's just not the case. For lots and lots of applications, for power management, for radio communications, you actually want the big chips because they produce more power, greater signal, and are much more essential for those tasks. So when you think about the majority of our weapon systems, literally like 98% of the chips that go into our weapon systems are foundational chips. Pretty important, right? But even if you think about AI, there's one chip that is, that's a GPU that is really advanced, and the memory as well, that is in that server that's training your AI applications or is running the AI models. But there's literally 3 to 4 dozen foundational chips that do everything from power management to run your screen to networking, and lots of other things, right? So without those chips, you still don't have an AI server, you have nothing. And that's true of literally every single device you have. And what we did is we published this report that looked at China's progress in foundational chips. So we've done a lot as a country that is very good in the last couple of years in trying to curtail Chinese ambitions in advancing in the leading edge. So preventing them from getting to the 3 nanometers to the 2 nanometers, preventing them from acquiring the equipment that you need to manufacture those chips. But we've sort of said, well, everything that's sort of above 18 nanometers, that's legacy, that's mature. We don't care if they own it, right? And this report looks at Chinese investments in those areas, as well as their market practices where they're engaging basically in state-subsidized price dumping designed to literally destroy the rest of the industry in the foundational chips market, where in 5 years' time, according to our predictions, they will corner the market on foundational chips. So literally, the vast majority of the chips market, they will have. And yes, the West will continue to have, most likely, the lead on advanced chips. But again, without foundational chips, you don't have a single device. You don't even have a phone because you don't have the GPS, you don't have the power, you don't have the Wi-Fi, you don't have the accelerometer, you don't have the things that make that phone a phone. So that is really a great concern. So we need to make sure that we're looking at the entire scope of the semiconductor industry when we're thinking about de-risking from China, when we're trying to think about how to contain them and their ambitions and do the things that I believe is the most thing that's important for us over the next 10 to 15 years, which is deter an invasion of Taiwan. Because that invasion, regardless of how it unfolds, will be a disaster for the world, for the United States in particular, and we have to deter that at all costs.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's what you're really getting at, I think, is that it's a combination of things. It takes a village, right, when it comes to chips, and you cannot just abandon the more legacy, which you just said you're trying to change the terminology. But I think you just touched on what I think is the obvious elephant in the room here too. So you've just returned from Taipei, and I think probably the whole room would love to know what your perspective is on the likelihood of invasion. And you mentioned deterrence, which I absolutely agree. I think any conflagration in the South China Sea would be terrible, probably for all involved. And so deterrence, I think, is key. And I would love to hear your perspective about that. How do we deter? What works? What doesn't?
Yeah. So this is actually the subject of my upcoming book, World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. It's available now on pre-orders on Amazon and your favorite bookstores. But basically, it's a blueprint for how do we deter China. And I make a couple of arguments in the book. One is that we are unequivocally, no question about it, are in Cold War II. Not 2.0, because it's not a continuation of the first one. It's a very different Cold War, and there are certainly a lot of things that are quite different about the aspect of this confrontation. First of all, the alliances are not as rigid as they were in Cold War I. There's less of an ideological element to it. Obviously, a lot more economic interdependence. But just like World War I was very different from World War II, but they were both world wars, I believe this is Cold War II, just like the first one was Cold War I. And just like in Cold War I, we have this piece of land, this relatively small piece of land, that is the flashpoint that can bring two superpowers, United States and China in this case, to the brink of war. That would be disastrous for the planet, two nuclear powers. I don't have to explain to your audience how dangerous that can be. And in Cold War I, we actually had the same situation, and it was called West Berlin, right? For the first 20 years, 15 years of Cold War I, you had this aggression that was taking place by the Soviets against West Berlin. It resulted in the Berlin airlift, of course, in the 1940s. And then Khrushchev, around 1958, actually decided, we now know from recently declassified Soviet materials, decided to try to take Berlin by force, assuming that America would not fight for this little piece of land that is surrounded by East Germany and the Soviet-controlled forces there. But he miscalculated, and he was shocked that Kennedy was actually taking the position that we would fight and potentially even go into nuclear conflict over West Berlin because of the principles and the strategic interests that we have there. I cite in the book this episode where in 1961, in August of 1961, Kennedy is woken up and he's told that the East Germans have started building the wall that separates East Berlin from West Berlin, and he sighs in relief, right? Really, really amazing to think about it now, because we've been thinking about the wall as being this evil construction. But Kennedy celebrates this effectively in private because he says if Khrushchev is building the wall, that means he's not invading.
Yeah.
That means the risk of war has just dramatically dropped. And indeed, you still had the next year, obviously, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was actually an outgrowth of the West Berlin crisis. But after that, you had 25 years of relative stability in the Cold War, where, yes, you had Vietnam, yes, you had Afghanistan, you had different conflicts around the world, but the risk that the United States and the Soviet Union would go to war with each other just diminished drastically, right? And that is essentially Taiwan, that we're not going to go to war with China over Senkaku Islands or Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. No way. But we might go to war with China over Taiwan, right? And we need to do whatever we can to deter China from invading this little piece of land, which is even more strategic to us, I believe, than West Berlin ever was during Cold War I.
Can you talk about that, actually? I think that gets undercovered, right? Why is it strategic? I always try to tell people more about that because I think some folks don't know.
Yeah, that's a great point. So a lot of people, and you see this even in the presidential campaign, the misconception evolving that Taiwan only matters to us because of chips.
Right.
While Taiwan mattered to us long before they produced a single chip, right? Douglas MacArthur in the 50s famously called it the unsinkable aircraft carrier. The geopolitical position of Taiwan is so essential. I cite this map in the book. Like, everyone looks at Taiwan as this little sprinkle off the coast of China. But if you rotate the map and you put China at the top and you put Taiwan right in the center, you actually see this from the Chinese perspective, that Taiwan is what actually keeps China bottled up and being unable to dominate the Western Pacific, because the waters around the Chinese coasts are very shallow, both in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And only once you get that past that first island chain, in which Taiwan is really the cornerstone, right? On the other side, you have Japan. On the other side, you have the Philippines. Only on the other side of that first island chain does the water become much, much deeper. So, for example, in the Taiwan Straits, the depth of the water is about 300 feet. You can't even put a submarine in there without it being immediately detected, and it's even too shallow for that. But on the other side of the strait of the island, it immediately drops to like 1,500 feet, right? So and goes deep, much deeper, obviously, as you go into the ocean. So for naval power projection, for the ability to threaten Japan, for the ability to threaten the Philippines, for the ability to eject the United States Navy out of this crucial area that is really the future of the century in terms of economics, in terms of trade, Taiwan is absolutely critical. So I would argue if Taiwan did not have a single chip or even had no people on it, it would still be absolutely vital to the United States and to our interests and to our ability to enforce global security order in the Western Pacific and beyond. That's why Taiwan matters, and that's why Taiwan matters to China too. There's certainly a lot of history here, although as we talk in the book, we go deeply into Taiwan history. Most people don't appreciate, but there was never actually time when China fully dominated Taiwan. Never, right? So people talk about potential reunification. It's actually not a reunification. It would be a unification because Taiwan has a different culture, even slightly different language. The Taiwanese is an outgrowth of Mandarin, but it's slightly different. They believe they're a country. Visiting Taiwan, speaking to lots of regular people there, as well as the people in power, I came away with a very distinct feeling that even if China was a Jeffersonian democracy, sort of the beacon of the world, the Taiwanese would have zero interest in unifying with China. They've got their own thing going. They want to be their own country, right? So just as Canadians don't want to be part of the United States, even if we're richer and more powerful, they're proud to be Canadians. The Taiwanese are proud to be the Taiwanese. And obviously the fact that it's a CCP and they've seen what happens in Xinjiang, they're seeing what happens in Hong Kong, there's zero interest in unifying voluntarily, which is why China really is looking at this as their only option to do this by force. And I tell you something, in 2021, about 3 months before the invasion of Ukraine, I publicly went on Twitter and predicted that Putin was going to invade Taiwan before the winter was over. Unfortunately, I was proven right. I look at the situation with Xi and Taiwan, and I see the same dynamics evolving. I don't think it's happening soon. I think we have probably at least 5 years, probably at least until late 2028, before China will be ready to move on Taiwan. But on one hand, it's 5 years. On the other hand, it's just 5 years. It's not a lot, and it's a very precarious situation.
Yeah, and I mean 5 years particularly on a military time scale, on a preparation time scale, it's a blink of an eye. So that's an interesting prediction. Prediction made it.
You can't field the new weapons. You can't even field a new weapon system in that time frame.
Exactly. So I think with that being said, and having just been there, you were kind of talking about the national mood about wanting to continue on their own path in Taiwan. But do you feel what was your sense on your recent visit, particularly of the spirit? Like you mentioned Ukraine. I think it was really incredible seeing how much fighting spirit the Ukrainians had, and they obviously would not have been able to get this far without that fighting spirit. Do you see the same thing in Taiwan?
So I see remarkable similarities with Ukraine, which are actually not great. Talking to many Ukrainians before the war, no one believed that the war was coming. And a lot of them were actually not ready to fight. This really came about very, very quickly. And I'll give you one example. I was talking to this friend of mine who's a Green Beret who went over to Ukraine and volunteered to fight in their armed forces in their Foreign Legion. He was telling me the story that he got to Ukraine about a month before the war. He was in the southern city of Mykolaiv in a bar talking to this bartender. And he was talking to him about the prospects of war, and the guy was kind of dismissing it. And then he said, this is all politics. I don't care if the Russians are in Kyiv or if the Ukrainians are in Kyiv. This doesn't, affect me in the least bit. I just want to run my business, run my bar, right, and go on my way. And then the war begins, and my friend is fighting in the Donbass, and he's texting. He got the number of this bartender. He's texting with him, and he finds out that the guy mobilized. It's like, what's going on here, right?
Yeah.
You didn't care just a couple of weeks ago, and you said, well, what happened is that I have a friend in the city of Kherson, one of the first cities large cities that the Russians took, and he sent me this video of a Russian tank driving down the street of Kherson, and then stopping, pointing a turret at a building and at a balcony where you had women and children gathering and shooting and killing them all. And he said, what? After that, I mobilized immediately, right? And that's what happened, is that you had the Russians be so barbaric, right, and doing Bucha and all kinds of atrocities that were really pointless, right? They had no military value whatsoever. That helped to turn the population against them very, very quickly. I remember, and many of you may remember if you were watching it closely, the first days of the war, you had these videos of Russian armored vehicles that were getting stuck on the highways because they were running out of fuel. And you had civilian Ukrainians just driving by on the highway in their cars and just laughing at the Russians, saying, haha, you're incompetent, go home, right? No one would be doing that today, right? They would be getting out of their cars, taking out their kitchen knives and slaughtering every Russian they would see, right? Because of what the Russians had done. And obviously President Zelensky staying in Kyiv, saying he would fight to the death there, help to mobilize the country. So we don't know what's going to happen in Taiwan, right? A lot of the people are behaving just like the Ukrainians behave, which is like, you know what, I'm not sure I want to die for this. I don't know if we have a choice, but with the right leadership, and if they believe that the Chinese are going to commit atrocities, like they're probably prone to do, you might as well see a significant resistance. But really, the key to this, I spent a lot of time analyzing how China would invade. What most people don't realize is that Taiwan is practically a natural fortress. It is so difficult to invade. The Taiwan Straits, 150 days out of the year, is typhoons and stormy weather that makes it absolutely impossible to launch an amphibious operation. If you manage to land on the beaches, you're faced right up against a mountain that you have to cross. There are tunnels and rivers and bridges all over the place that could be blown, and would make it very, very difficult to advance. I couldn't imagine a worse place to orchestrate an invasion against. So with a little bit of effort, you can actually prevent the Chinese from establishing a beachhead on the island. The challenge is, would Taiwan move quickly enough to do so, hopefully with the US support? But this island is eminently defendable. The question is, will we have enough time, enough capability to actually defend it?
Yeah, and I guess on that front, and by the way, we'll break for Q&A. I do definitely want to get into some longer Q&A. If folks have questions, just stand up, and then I'll make sure to get to you. The mics are right here. I think on that front, it would be interesting to hear your perspective here, because there's kind of this ongoing debate, right? What would happen? Is it more likely to be a blockade? I think in my mind, I see hybrid warfare as a strategy emerging all over, and I think that there's a lot of different ways that the Chinese might prep for an invasion. Yeah. What's your perspective on that? What do you see as likely?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the book and thinking about the different scenarios. I think the only scenario that works is invasion. A blockade has never worked in modern history. I mean, you have the example of Leningrad that was surrounded, for 300 days by the Nazis, and it didn't surrender. The thing is, like, a lot of people say that, the Taiwanese are relying on food and energy imports, and that's true today, but the island is actually very capable of sustaining itself if it had to. So I don't see a blockade resulting in the Taiwanese surrendering. I don't think they'll surrender due to hybrid warfare. There's just no examples of that in history. Even a bombing campaign, has never won a single war, right? You have the Battle of Britain, where the Germans were trying to bomb Britain into smithereens, didn't break their spirit.
And you don't see them winning an election or doing something.
No, because you have, obviously, the country is very divided in Taiwan. So you have the DPP, which is more pro-independence party that's currently in charge, that's running for re-election in January. You have two other parties, the KMT, which has ruled the island under a military dictatorship since the 1940s until the 2000s, and another smaller party, TPP, that people say are pro-China. They're not really pro-China. I would say, more pro-appeasement. Their view is that if we only appease China, if we become friends with them, they're not going to invade. But no one on the political spectrum in Taiwan is for unification. Not the KMT, not the TPP, certainly not the DPP. So, and in fact, more and more Taiwanese today see themselves as Taiwanese first and Chinese second in terms of their identity. So I don't think that any of that has a chance of working. And in fact, all of those efforts have only strengthened the Taiwanese resolve and done the opposite of what Xi Jinping desires. So I think that's the challenge, is that Xi Jinping is going to realize at some point that the only way that he can bring Taiwan into China's orbit in his lifetime — the guy just turned 70, by the way, so maybe he's got another 10 years in power or so — is by invasion. And an invasion, even if it's defeated, as I said, is going to be a complete disaster for the world, probably immediately global depression, not to mention the thousands that are going to die, probably American lives as well, potential for strikes on Chinese mainland and retaliation against U.S. mainland, just an absolute disaster of a situation. So we have to make sure that he wakes up every single day and thinks, today is not the day. But also crucially, and this is really hard, that tomorrow might be. Because if he thinks that his window is closing, right, and if he doesn't do it now, it will never succeed, even if chances are low, he might still go for it. So that's a delicate balance we have to strike.
So do we have any questions from the audience? Just step up to the mic. I know I certainly do if you don't. I think we've got one coming. And thank you, Dmitri. I think I agree with that assessment. I think I've had that conversation with a number of folks before. Go ahead.
My question, Dmitri, is on Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing. You can war game several scenarios, but the bottom line is, why are they still able to produce on Taiwan? If I was China, knowing that that is the engine of the world's AI, and they can't get it, why would they let us have it? Or do they wait 5 years and take it out then? But by then, TSMC will have their other fabs operating. Isn't that a major piece of the timeline here?
So there's this common misconception about the CHIPS Act that the $52 billion plus about $25 billion in tax credits are going to dramatically reduce our reliance on Taiwan. And that's just not the case. So today, United States produces about 12% of the world's chips. With the CHIPS Act, we'll go up about 8% to about 20%. Taiwan, in any scenario for the next decade, is still going to produce the vast majority of the chips that we need at the advanced nodes, and a huge chunk of them at the foundational nodes. There's just too much capacity there that is not going to be replicated anywhere else, too much talent base. And by the way, China needs it too. China is relying on Taiwan just as we are, and are becoming more so on the advanced side as their own industry is not able to to manufacture those advanced chips because of the U.S. export controls. So it's a double-edged sword. Yes, China can destroy those fabs, but that's going to be a lot like shooting itself in the foot and shooting the whole world in the foot, because it's not just the United States. Literally, the entire world depends on microelectronics manufactured in Taiwan. So it will instantly cause a global depression. And guess who's going to get the blame for it? China. So they have to walk this very carefully. And if they orchestrate an invasion, I'm sure they will try to think about a way to do that in a way that keeps those fabs operational so that they can grab them and continue operating them. That will be very, very difficult, because even minor power disruptions will cause problems for the clean rooms. And obviously there's potential for the Taiwanese to destroy them. There's potential for the US to destroy them. So it's part of the challenge of that China faces in planning this invasion.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question over here.
You sort of just answered my question, which is, conversely, what would the U.S. do to those fabs in Taiwan do if China did have some success in an invasion?
Yeah, so I think very likely we would take action against them if we actually think that China is about to actually succeed and take over the island. There's other ways, by the way, we can destroy them too. There's ability to brick some of those equipment machines remotely. Those fabs are completely reliant on Western equipment coming from the US, from Netherlands, from Japan. So you shut that off, you shut off the maintenance for that, and those fabs don't run. They're completely dependent on chemicals and precursors that are coming from Japan. You shut off that, and nothing gets made. So there's a whole slew of scenarios in which we can destroy those fabs even without physically destroying them. We might very well decide to take action if we think all is lost. But we're a long way from that, hopefully.
Over here.
Dmitri, Rich Marshall, good to see you again. Thank you very much, my friend. I was recently in Japan in December associated with TSMC activities, and they're building a very large facility in the southern tip of Japan, which traditionally is the theoretical invasion point for China, since it's the closest proximity. It's Yakamoto area. The facility is supposedly a fab plant, but it is over-designed for a fab plant. I physically visited it. They will not let any Japanese inside. They're ignoring, and presumably violating, Japanese environmental considerations. Everyone who works there is from, quote, Taiwan. I'm sure you're aware of that. I would be interested in hearing your views. Thank you.
I'm actually not familiar with that specific facility, Rich, so I'd have to look into it.
Well, on that note, we are at time, but thank you so much, Dmitri, for everything. I know you were very busy today, and you were rushing through traffic probably to make it to this, and it means a lot to us, and this has been fascinating. I think it's probably the geopolitical issue of our era, particularly in the Pacific region. So,
yeah. Thanks for having me. A lot more on this in my book, so hopefully people can check it out.
Yeah, I put the link up, so you can pre-order Dmitri's book. The WhatsApp group for this conference has that link in it. You can find it there.
Great, thank you.
You already got orders. Thank you.